New discoveries and supposed discoveries reopened the debate. The first was the discovery of the 1826, and we're not going to talk about that. Russ Anderson talked about it yesterday. Prior to this, as I think he noted, and Matt Roper made some comments about it, this presumably authentic document, most LDS apologists, including Widstow, Kirkham, and Nibley, denied that there was such a court case or that it ever happened. Now, with the emergence of the Hoffman forgeries, especially against the Salamander letter, the Saints saw renewed interest in Joseph Smith and his early Seer Stone activities. LDS scholars began to seriously study the issue, and new conclusions were the result. And some of these conclusions weren't a lot different than what the anti-Mormons were saying, that was he involved in treasure digging. Marvin Hill pointed out that both sides have seemingly assumed until very recently that if Joseph Smith believed in and practiced magic to find buried treasure, and magic probably did in quotations there, then his story of the inspired discovery of the plates of the Book of Mormon was suspect. Now, however, we know that that was part of the culture. And again, Russ Anderson addressed that yesterday, that there was a lot of people outside of Latter-day Saints that were involved in looking for treasures. D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and Magic Worldview was most likely influenced by Hoffman's forgeries, and thus they were based on some false premises. However, his chapter on seer stones and treasure digging, Richard Anderson wrote to me once, that it has validity. Hoffman's forgeries also sparked BYU studies to devote an entire issue to Joseph's treasure digging days. The combination of Hoffman's forgeries and old anti-Mormon arguments forced Latter-day Saint scholars to research, and that research ended up adding additional life to early LDS cultures and Joseph Smith's early Seer Stone days. Smith family. At times, critics have opened other windows in the early life of Smith and his family. Brother Twentis, for instance, noted that he found some interesting yet unfamiliar details about the religious turmoil in Joseph Smith's time when he was reviewing one critic's work. And when Quinn wrote about the timing of Joseph's marriage to Emma and how Joseph brought Emma with him to get the plates because Alvin, who originally the angel said bring Alvin, well, Alvin was dead. And so Joseph brought Emma. Richard Lloyd Anderson, when I queried him on this, he said that Quinn is onto a legitimate body of material here and puts it all out fairly well, however, with his own interpretations. Richard L. Bushman notes that through years of research, LDS critics Marquardt and Walters have dug up tidbits of info to help us understand life among the Smiths. Their studies, Bushman observed, has added new material to the record of Joseph Smith. He points out, however, that they have a lot of errors in their conclusions. First Vision. In 1967, Mormon critic Wesley P. Walters wrote a tract entitled New Light on Mormon Origins, which challenged the traditional account of Joseph Smith's events leading to the First Vision. He questioned if there was really a revival in the 1820s. He said if there was no revival, then there's no First Vision. The tract stimulated a host of activity, including the creation of a BYU group that went back to Palmyra to research the First Vision. In 1969, an entire issue of BYU study was devoted to research. This issue, notes Daniel Bachman, almost single-handedly, along with the discovery of Palmyra, rejuvenated BYU studies. Milton Bachman's books on the First Vision restoration, for example, were outgrowths of that group's efforts. The controversy also prompted research and publications by LDS historian Larry Porter. Such research might not have arisen had it not been for Walters' article. Bachman believes that, quote, the influence of Walters and the BYU group still influence historical research today. New Midgley observed, to me, we are almost always a step behind the critics. The initial serious look at the Palmyra materials and the so-called issue of whether there was a revival that got Joseph Smith started, and a host of similar issues were originally motivated by our desire to have a reasonable response to our critics. 2 years after Walter published his article, Dialogue republished it in an updated version, as well as a response by Richard Bushman. While Bushman had some disagreements with Walters' conclusions, he also recognized that Walters had set us back because Mr. Walters, quote, took an entirely new track and followed it with admirable care. And I continue his quote, were the revivals in 1819 to 20 in the vicinity of Palmyra, as Joseph said? Everyone up until now had assumed that of course they were. Walters said no, and the sources of his answers were impressive. They stood apart from the biased materials on which most anti-Mormon work is based. They were contemporaneous with the event, and they were right to the point. Our consternation was a genuine compliment to the quality of Walters' work. While Mr. Walters has put us on the spot for a moment, in the long run, Mormon scholarship will benefit from his attack. Not only was there an immediate effort to question to answer the question of an 1819 revival, but Mormon historians ask themselves how many other questions about our early history remain unasked as well as unanswered. Without wholly intending it, Mr. Walters may have done as much to advance the cause of Mormon history within the church as anyone in recent years. Now, even more recently, Bushman has written on the ongoing research of Palmyra revivals, quote, "Can we reconcile all the conflicting evidence and get back to the actual chronology of the events from 1816 to 1824? At this point, we must acknowledge the possibility of an error somewhere in Joseph's chronology, simply because of the internal contradiction. On the other hand, we are well advised to take care of throwing out the report of a person who was on the scene merely because circumstantial evidence raises doubts." Other historical issues that have surfaced because of charges of the critics, we've learned more. Richard Anderson's important work on the Book of Mormon Witnesses, excellent book, and again, part of it devoted to answering directly critics. Joseph Smith's possible ownership of the Jupiter talisman, and also even Michael Quinn's article on the involvement of LDS women in the blessing of the sick. And I throw him in. At the time, he was not out of the church, but he was a critic to many degrees, and anyhow, that's brought more study around. Okay, let's move on to some of the smaller categories here. How much time we've got left? Book of Abraham studies. In 1879, Reynolds and Sajodal, I don't know how he pronounces that, Sajodal, whatever, had observed that while the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price had been, quote, vigorously attacked by opponents, the saints had, quote, written little in its defense. Little seemed to change for a number of years. And in 1912, the critics again made some virtually uncontested charges against the Book of Mormon. Nibley complained that the saints, quote, frankly admitted their ignorance and pleaded that they had been caught by surprise, unquote. But again, nothing changed. The saints had the opportunity to fortify their Book of Mormon scholarship, but they failed to do so. So in 1967, when things heated up, when the Metropolitan Museum of Art presented the Joseph Smith Papyri to the church, Hugh Nibley lamented the saints' lack of response in 1912 and their disregard for the stimulus such criticisms might have provided for deeper scholarship. He said, faced by a solid phalanx of PhDs, which the Egyptologists criticized the Book of Abraham, the Mormons were properly overawed. They had no data to go against these Goliaths. And for that, they had only themselves to blame. The Mormons would have done well in undertaking some study of Egyptian on their own. Now, Nibley notes that Joseph and Brigham had pleaded with the saints for years to use your brains and to prepare yourselves just for such eventualities. But when critics attacked in 1912, the saints had not turned the stumbling blocks into stepping stones. They had passed on the opportunity. The Mormons, Nibley criticized, appeared to, quote, have gone all out for the gimmicks and mechanics of education, but have never evinced any real inclination to tackle the tough, basic questions of evidence raised by the Pearl of Great Price. And then Nibley shares some advice that I think is still insightful today. One should not enter the arena unless one is willing to meet more formidable opposition than the gullible student and tractable layman. It behooves us to understand the opposition, know where they're coming from, know why they have the arguments. Now, when the rediscovered Joseph Smith Papyri was the dialogue, printed some articles about it with some from Tanner and Hugh Nibley and others researching the Book of Mormon, and some of those issues they brought up are still being researched today. Through the past few decades, the Book of Abraham, I might say Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham has seen increased attention from LDS scholars and research, and of course critics. Nibley produced several works on the subject and hopes soon to finish his decades-long One Eternal Round. And the critics have helped to sharpen pencils along the way. In 1979, for instance, at the Sunstone Symposium, LDS critic Ed Ashman pointed out some supposed errors in Nibley's assessments of the Joseph Papyri. Nibley responded graciously, thanking Ashman for the constructive criticisms. Book of Mormon is penned by Abraham. Evidence suggests that possibly some early Latter-day Saints believed that the Egyptian papyri were actually penned by those authors who were linked to the documents. So back up again, another one's missing. In an 1841 example, William Appleby observed that, quote, there is a perceptible difference between the writings of Joseph of old and Abraham. Joseph, wrote Appleby, appears to have been the best scribe, which suggests that he thought they were actually written, scribed by those two people. That's one of the possible interpretations. Critics, of course, have pointed out that the papyri is far too recent to be written actually by Abraham. And if it's not, then what's the connection? John Gee explains that there is a major difference between the date of a text, the information contained on the papyri, and the date of the manuscript, the papyri itself. For example, Paul's letter to the Galatians was written in the 1st century.